My mom asked me to take care of the man who broke our family, called me horrible names, and made my childhood a nightmare. And when I laughed in her face, she was shocked. So for some context, my mom broke up my family when I was 6, and my brother was 11, to be with my stepdad. Our dad moved to a neighboring state, and we only got to see him every other weekend. I've only connected all these details as an adult. My brother and I are now both in our 30s, and my dad didn't share details of the divorce until the last few years. To say I lost a lot of respect for my mom and stepdad is an understatement. My mom chose to replace our dad with an angry alcoholic and thought we'd make a big happy family. Hint: it never happened. I forgive them, it was years ago, but respect is gone. Growing up with them was stressful and like walking on eggshells. If I had a disagreement with my stepdad, my mom would come home and only talk to him about what happened, before giving me a punishment. The day my brother graduated high school, he moved out. We both had nothing but disdain for my stepdad. He got drunk every single day and was mean, never physically, but verbally. I'll never forget being called a whore for going on a date with my boyfriend, or us following a young woman to her home after she flipped us off on the road. After I became an adult and got married at a young age, our relationship improved. I've now been married for almost 13 years, and we have 2 little girls together. When my stepdad comes to our house, we get along great. However, we went back to their home for Thanksgiving a few years ago, and it was very stressful. Many parts of me felt like I was stepping back into high school again. Fast forward to a conversation I had with my mom recently. We were discussing children taking in their parents in their old age. Something, I might add, my mom never did for my grandma after my grandpa died. Why? Because my stepdad couldn't live with her. None of her other 3 kids took her in either, and she managed okay, passing away in her own home with my mom and aunt at her side. Anyhow, we were discussing the subject and how many parents might be taken in by their children after their spouses pass away. So, for example, my mom coming to stay with us after my stepdad passes away, my mill, or my dad, etc. She said she hoped that if she passed away, that I would consider taking my stepdad in if he were elderly. I actually laughed out loud before even considering how a reaction might hurt her feelings. First of all, even if it were my own dad, I would prefer to take in one of our moms if I'm going to be a primary caregiver. And of course, if we never actually took anyone into our home, we would still help and support them however we could. But my mom, expecting this of me with my stepdad? What magical land is this, where irony doesn't exist? I have never considered him a father figure. He played a huge role in breaking apart my family at a young age and refused to take in my terminally ill grandma when she needed it most. None of our parents are live with us age yet. Even if they were widowed or became single, they are young enough that they'd want to be independent for a while longer. So, this topic is a while off yet, thankfully. I truly think the only person we'd actually made the commitment for is my MIL, and my mom and my dad would get other support like they offered their ailing parents. So, aita for laughing? Update 1. The whole conversation with my mom about my stepdad stuck with me. I kept thinking about how she could seriously expect me to take him in after everything. It felt delusional, but maybe I was being harsh. I figured I'd call my brother, who usually cuts through the nonsense with a bluntness I've come to appreciate. So I explained the situation to him, trying not to leave out any details. I even told him about the laugh, which, in hindsight, probably sounded worse than it was. He went quiet for a moment, and then he burst out laughing. He was laughing so hard I thought he dropped the phone. "Wait," he said between breaths. "She actually thinks we would take him in? Does she even remember who we are?" I told him I thought the same thing, but the way she'd said it made me think she was serious. He got quiet again, and I knew he was thinking. "Do you think something's going on with them?" he finally asked. At first, I didn't know what he meant. I asked if he thought she was having marital problems, and he pointed out that our stepdad's drinking hadn't slowed down in years. If anything, it had probably gotten worse. He mentioned how she always used to cover for him when we were younger, brushing off his behavior or outright denying it. "Maybe she's trying to plan an exit strategy," he said. "Or maybe she's just overwhelmed and doesn't know what to do." That hit me. I hadn't thought about it like that. I mean, I knew their marriage wasn't perfect, but it hadn't occurred to me that she might be looking for a way out. The thought made me feel a little guilty, but also annoyed. Why should I be part of the solution to a problem I didn't create? A couple of weeks passed, and I didn't think much more about it until my mom called me again. She rarely calls. She's more of a texter, so I already knew something was up. Her voice was shaky, and she kept going on about how family needs to stick together and support each other. It was all very vague at first, but then she circled back to the same topic about parents living with their kids in old age. This time, she said it more directly. She started talking about how it might not even be her, but how she'd feel better knowing my stepdad had somewhere to go if something ever happened to her. That's when I cut her off. "Mom," I said, "this isn't going to happen. I'm sorry, but no." She tried to guilt me, saying I didn't understand, and that it wasn't about me, it was about family. I reminded her as calmly as I could that he's not my family. He never has been. I told her I sympathized with her situation, but it wasn't fair to put that kind of responsibility on me or my brother. She got defensive, saying I was being selfish and cruel. At that point, I snapped a little. I reminded her of all the times she chose him over us, of how she let him create a toxic environment for years. I brought up specific examples like the time he called me a whore for going on a date, or how he refused to take in Grandma when she was sick. I told her that if she couldn't see why I wouldn't want him in my home, then there wasn't much else to say. She hung up on me. I called my brother right after to tell him what happened. He wasn't surprised, but he did say something that stuck with me. He said, "You did what you had to do. She needs to figure this out on her own." That should have been the end of it, but a few days later my stepdad called me. He's never called me before, so I almost didn't answer. When I did, I immediately regretted it. He was drunk, slurring his words, and clearly angry. He accused me of turning my mom against him and said I was an ungrateful brat who didn't know how hard he worked to provide for us. I didn't even let him finish. I told him he had no right to talk to me like that, and hung up. Then I blocked his number. After that, my brother called me again with an update. Apparently, my mom had moved out. She was staying with a friend and had told him she was thinking about separating from my stepdad. He said she sounded scared but also relieved, like a weight had been lifted off her shoulders. I felt a weird mix of emotions hearing that. On one hand, I was glad she was finally taking some steps to prioritize herself. On the other hand, it brought up all these unresolved feelings from our childhood. My brother and I ended up talking for hours that night, rehashing stuff we hadn't talked about in years. In the weeks that followed, my mom started opening up more about her situation. She admitted that my stepdad's drinking had gotten worse and that she'd been unhappy for a long time. She said she didn't know how to leave before because she felt trapped, but hearing me and my brother talk about our boundaries made her realize she needed to make a change. I told her I was proud of her for taking that step, but I also made it clear that it didn't change how I felt about my stepdad. I said I'd support her in any way I could, but he was not my responsibility and never would be. She seemed to understand, but there's still a lot to unpack. Looking back, I don't regret laughing. It might have been the wake-up call she needed. Sometimes a little tough love is the only way to break the cycle. Update 2. After everything that went down, I thought the situation would cool off, but instead it got more complicated. My mom moving out wasn't the clean break I assumed it would be. At first, she stayed with her friend, and my brother said she seemed like she was adjusting to life without my stepdad. She was talking about finding a place of her own and even mentioned getting a part-time job to keep herself busy. It sounded promising, but then the backtracking started. About 2 weeks after moving out, she called me. She sounded hesitant, almost like she was embarrassed. She started rambling about how my stepdad was trying to make amends, saying he'd started going to AA meetings and promised to cut back on his drinking. She said he was being so sweet, and he'd written her a long letter apologizing for everything. She told me she wasn't sure if leaving him was the right decision. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to be supportive, but another part was screaming, "Don't do this again." I told her it was good that he was making an effort, but she needed to focus on what she wanted, not just what he was promising. "Mom, he's made promises before," I reminded her. "This isn't the first time he's said he'll change." She got quiet, and I could tell she was trying to justify it in her head. She said things were different this time, that he was taking it seriously because he realized how close he was to losing her. I didn't push too hard because I knew she wasn't ready to hear it, but I told her to think long and hard before going back. A few days later, my brother called me. Apparently, our stepdad had been calling him too, trying to play the victim. He said our mom was overreacting, that she'd been influenced by me and my brother, and that we had no right to interfere in their marriage. My brother wasn't having it and told him straight up that we weren't responsible for fixing their problems. He tried to guilt trip me, my brother said, sounding annoyed. He actually said, "After everything I've done for you two, this is how you repay me? Like we owe him something." It was the same manipulation tactic he'd used on us as kids, and it made my blood boil. I told my brother to block his number if he hadn't already. He said he was thinking about it, but wanted to see if our stepdad would slip up and admit to something he could use to convince our mom to stay away. About a week after that, things took a turn. My mom called me again, but this time she was crying. She said she'd gone back to the house to talk to my stepdad, and while he was initially sweet and apologetic, things escalated quickly. He started drinking during their conversation, and by the end of the night, he was yelling and blaming her for everything. She said she left in a hurry and went back to her friend's house, but now she felt even more confused. "I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "I want to believe he can change, but I don't think I can trust him anymore." Hearing her like that broke my heart, but it also made me angry. I told her she needed to stop putting herself in situations where he could manipulate her. I suggested she look into therapy, not just for herself, but also to process everything she'd been through in their marriage. She said she'd think about it, but I could tell she wasn't fully convinced. After we hung up, I called my brother. We agreed that if our mom went back to him, there wasn't much we could do. We'd support her as much as we could, but we weren't going to enable her or let her drag us into their drama. Then came the twist I didn't see coming. My mom's friend, the one she was staying with, called me out of the blue. She said she didn't want to overstep, but she thought I should know something. Apparently, my mom had confided in her that my stepdad had started showing up at her workplace unannounced, trying to convince her to come back. He wasn't being violent, but his behavior was erratic and escalating. I thanked her for letting me know and immediately called my mom. She tried to downplay it, saying he was just lost and didn't know how to handle the separation. I told her this wasn't normal or acceptable behavior, and she needed to take it seriously. I even suggested she consider getting a restraining order if he didn't back off. She didn't like that idea, saying it would escalate things, but I could tell she was scared. I told her to call me or my brother if she ever felt unsafe, no matter what. She promised she would, but I still felt uneasy after the conversation. A few days later, my brother called me with another update. He'd done some digging and found out that my stepdad hadn't been going to AA like he claimed. Instead, he'd been going to the bar down the street and telling anyone who'd listen that his wife had left him because her kids poisoned her against him. "He's not just lying to her," my brother said. "He's creating this whole narrative where he's the victim, and we're the bad guys." I wasn't surprised, but it still stung. I told my brother we needed to sit down with our mom and lay everything out. We couldn't make decisions for her, but we could at least give her the full picture and let her decide what to do with it. We set up a time to meet at her friend's house, and when we got there, she looked exhausted. We told her everything we'd learned, from his lies about AA to his bar sob stories. She didn't seem shocked, just defeated. "I don't know why I keep giving him chances," she said quietly. My brother leaned forward and said, "Because you want to believe he's the person you thought he was when you married him. But he's not, and he never will be." It was a harsh thing to say, but it was the truth. For the first time, I think she really heard it. This whole situation has been exhausting, but I feel like we're finally making progress. My mom hasn't gone back to him, and she started looking into therapy. My brother and I agreed to be there for her as much as we can, but we're also drawing boundaries. As for my stepdad, I don't know what's going to happen with him, and honestly, I don't care. He's not my responsibility, and he never will be. All I can do is hope my mom stays strong and doesn't get pulled back into his mess. Let's see what happens next. Update 3. After everything that had happened, my brother and I thought we'd reached a turning point with our mom. She hadn't gone back to my stepdad, she was seriously considering therapy, and she even started looking into her own apartment. Things felt like they were moving in the right direction. But, in true family drama fashion, it wasn't over yet. About 2 weeks after our last conversation, my mom dropped a bomb on us. She showed up at my house unannounced, which she almost never does. I could tell something was up from the moment I opened the door. She looked nervous, like she didn't want to tell me whatever was on her mind. After some small talk, she finally came out with it. "I think I might be pregnant," she said. I stared at her, trying to process the words. Pregnant? At her age? With his kid? It felt like a bad joke, but the look on her face told me she was serious. "How do you even know?" I asked, trying not to sound judgmental. She said she'd missed her period and had some symptoms that felt all too familiar. She hadn't taken a test yet because she was too scared, but she was almost certain. I didn't even know what to say. This was the last thing I expected to deal with. "Mom, have you told him?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She shook her head. "I don't know if I should," she said. "I don't even know if I want to keep it." That surprised me. My mom has always been very traditional, and I never thought I'd hear her say something like that. But I could tell she was overwhelmed, and honestly, so was I. I told her the first thing she needed to do was take a test and confirm it. There was no point in spiraling until she knew for sure. She nodded and agreed to do it, but only if I went with her. I could tell she was terrified, so I agreed. The next morning, I picked her up, and we went to the store to grab a test. Sitting in my bathroom while she waited for the results was one of the most surreal moments of my life. When the timer went off, she hesitated before looking at it. I finally grabbed it and checked for her. Positive. Neither of us said anything for a while. She just sat there, staring at the floor. Finally, she broke the silence. "What am I going to do?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer for her. I told her she needed to take some time to think about her options and figure out what she wanted, not what anyone else expected of her. I also told her that if she decided to keep it, there was no way she could do it with my stepdad in the picture. "You know he's not going to change," I said, "and bringing a baby into that environment is only going to make things worse." She nodded, but I could tell she wasn't fully processing it yet. A few days later, my brother and I sat down with her to talk things through. He was just as shocked as I was when he found out, but he was more focused on the logistics. He pointed out that she was already in a tough spot financially and emotionally, and adding a baby to the mix would make everything 10 times harder. "Look, we'll support you no matter what," he said, "but you need to be realistic about what this means." Our mom seemed torn. She kept saying she didn't want to make any rash decisions, but it was clear she was leaning toward keeping the baby. She said she felt like this was her chance to make up for all the mistakes she'd made with us. That hit me hard. I told her that having a baby wasn't going to erase the past, and she needed to focus on healing herself before trying to raise another child. My brother agreed and added that bringing my stepdad into the mix would only undo any progress she'd made. He reminded her of all the lies, manipulation, and drinking, and said there was no way he could be a positive influence on a child. She started crying, saying she felt like she was being pulled in a million directions. She said she didn't want to go back to my stepdad, but she was scared to do this alone. That's when my brother and I made a pact. If she kept the baby, we'd be there for her as much as we could, but only if she stayed away from him. The next big twist came when my stepdad found out. I don't know how he figured it out, but one day he showed up at my mom's friend's house, drunk and demanding to talk to her. She called me in a panic, and I rushed over with my brother. When we got there, he was standing in the driveway, yelling about how my mom was trying to steal his kid and ruin his life. My brother and I told him to leave, but he refused. Things got heated, and eventually the police had to get involved. He ended up getting arrested for public intoxication, which, honestly, felt like karma catching up with him. That incident was the final straw for my mom. She realized she couldn't keep living in this cycle of chaos. She decided to file for divorce and start fresh, with or without the baby. She also agreed to start therapy, which was a huge step forward. As of now, she's still figuring things out. She's leaning toward keeping the baby, but she's also looking into all her options. My brother and I are doing our best to support her while maintaining our boundaries. It's not easy, but it feels like we're finally moving in a positive direction. As for my stepdad, he's out of the picture for good. My mom got a restraining order, and my brother and I have made it clear that we're done with him. It's been a long, messy road, but I think we're finally getting to a place where we can heal and move forward. It's not the ending I expected, but maybe it's the one we needed.